Sportageous. Sport gets smarter.
Welcome to another video special here with Sportageous. Today we have Chris Hanebury on the show. He's a Canadian squash coach, a former junior and senior national champion, and he also runs the popular Serious Squash blog, which a lot of squash fans are very well aware of and follow his work. If you don't know about it, that's where he shares his own experiences in the game, from coaching to different developments in the sport. On Serious Squash, you can also find high-quality squash goods for purchase to help you improve your game, and he's also on Patreon, so go check that out. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Oh, thanks a lot for having me. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, same here. You know, you obviously do so many things in the squash space, and I wanted to sort of ask you with the first question, something a little bit outside the realm of the game of squash and more so on, I guess, the marketing side of things, which is, you know, one of the things that I often see coming up in discussion when I talk to mates and, you know, people within squash itself, which is squash and social media. So, you know, on Instagram, for example, with Serious Squash, you have over 10,000 followers. When I look at squash players, even, you know, I won't take names, but even in like the top 20 in the men's rankings, the women's rankings, I'll often find players who don't have public accounts, who have under, you know, forget 10,000, under 2,000 followers, are not regularly posting, and just not creating a brand. What are your views on that? And having been in that space, do you think that there's more that can be done there? Because I definitely think so, but do you think that there's more that can be done there, both from the context of the players, but also from the PSA and the tour?
Well, I definitely think the PSA should be doing a lot more because it's basically a free way to promote the sport. And as a small sport, I think social media is like, you know, probably the best platform that a sport can use if they're smart with it. And, you know, I can just relate personally to me, like starting when you're posting stuff, you kind of feel like, oh, like, I don't really want attention. So I think like just some players maybe have that perspective where they just, you know, they just are focused solely on their squash and that's all that matters. They're not thinking about post-career. And it's also just a lot of work to really like come up with, you know, maybe interesting content and always post things that, you know, look good. So I don't know if it's like that balance between what their focus is, how much work it takes. You know, maybe they just don't really want that attention. They just want to kind of focus more on, you know, their squash game. But there's a huge opportunity, I think, for, you know, increasing their sponsorship currently as a player and also just, you know, beyond their pro playing career, like just having opportunities for work or, you know, making contacts. You know, I know for sure it's helped me like with coaching and meeting different people around the world, probably with, you know, getting some jobs that I've had as well. And it's just a good way, I think, to, you know, you kind of do have to brand yourself. Like, it's not like you're in a team where the team's kind of promoting you and they have an account. Like, you know, I mean, yeah, PSA could do more to like promote each of the players, maybe like have links for like, you know, their Instagram or whatever, Facebook, when their matches are up. I mean, I feel like a lot of pro squash players also are kind of like don't really like sharing kind of what they're up to. So maybe that's part of it. Like, you know, some of the retired guys are great, like Ramy, Nick Matthew, Laura Mazzaro. Like, you know, I think they're really good at sharing some training tips and stuff. But, you know, I think it's a little more hush on, you know, the current players because, you know, they're competing against, you know, other amazing players. So if they gave away all their tips, you know, then obviously maybe they feel like they're losing a bit of an edge that they have over their competition. So yeah, I definitely think that's an area that, you know, the PSA could work at, and whether it's providing some kind of course, you know, basic instruction on like, you know, why this is important and look at the growth of the sport as a whole instead of, you know, it's, you know, don't worry about people looking at you as being wanting attention, or that I think it's, yeah, definitely a huge missed opportunity. So there's only a few actually active players I'd say are doing a really good job. Like Amanda Sobey's probably one of the better players, more active Instagram accounts, kind of has some fun with it, and you kind of get to see someone outside of the court, and it kind of makes you want to root for them because you can relate to them. You can see they're not, they don't have a big ego. Um, and I feel like that personal connection is something that the top players, or any player, I think, could benefit from.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. You touch on that aspect of personal and private, and sort of breaking uh, that barrier and people being hesitant to do it. But when you look at other sports, bigger sports, it's almost like a part of the job. So if you're an athlete, if you're representing yourself, you're representing your team, you're representing a country within the sport, you have to be on social media because it's going to grow the sport. So from your personal experience, and you touched on it a little bit about it also being a means to network and connect with relevant people, which in turn creates opportunities for you. Tell me, like, could you break down a little bit about that from your own experience and how that's benefited you, perhaps on the court itself, or even when it comes to serious squash?
Well, when I've done some traveling, I've met people who, recognize me just basically on the brand. And, and that even started before Instagram, like just having my blog. And I remember traveling in Malaysia, and I was at Penang Junior Open, and a parent came up to me. He was like, "Oh, are you from Serious Squash?" And I was like, "Yeah." And then he's like, "Oh, I love your blog." And like, it was really insightful. So, I just, it was kind of neat to go somewhere, and, you didn't tell anyone I was going there, but, it's kind of cool to know that people from all around the world, have that access where if they want to learn more about squash and hear my perspective, like there's not a lot of people doing that, especially for free. So I think, and later on, actually, his son and his daughter came overseas from Asia, and came and stayed with me in Canada for a week, and did some training with me twice. So yeah, so I mean, obviously that's just kind of one scenario, but it's definitely, if I never stepped out of my comfort zone and like just put myself out there on, because you're just saying your perspective, and I'm not always right. I don't know everything. Like, I was never number one in the world, but I have a lot of opinions and experience, and I'm not afraid to like share them. And I might say like, this is always going to be 100% factual, but this is what I think. Um, and I think that some people don't want to kind of go out there and say what they think, because they're not always 100% maybe confident in what they're saying. And and again, I think like in that first part, like they just want to keep it kind of discreet and not share maybe too many tips, and they want to just keep it, like if you're a coach, you want to just keep your tips for your athletes. And that's actually how I started Serious Squash, was like I wanted like my athletes to have a resource to like go and look at and like follow up on outside of practice. And then I started to think, well, why am I just only doing this for my athletes? Like, I don't care. Like, if there's some really keen person, in England or South Africa or wherever, like, I'm happy that they have that opportunity, because I wish I had that opportunity when I was a kid. Like, I was so keen to learn more, but it was so hard to find information. It was so hard to find video. So I think that's why I started to, try to promote it a bit more internationally, and welcomed it. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you've essentially been able to do is bring squash, even if it's to, and that's essentially the job. If you're able to bring it out from that shell or that bubble even a bit, that's breaking breaking that bubble, or breaking that notion that squash is limited to people who are only within squash. And what you said ties in really well with another, like it got me thinking. And when you talk about, once again, coming back to that idea of not wanting to share tips, uh, people being very sort of concerned, and that's a completely viable reason. The fact that I don't I don't want my competitor, my competition to know what I'm doing that gives me the edge. But I come back to the same point. When you look at other sports, athletes are willing to give away, or their coaches or their teams are willing to give away aspects of what they do, because on the one hand, it's, you're doing that favor of promoting the game, and on the other hand, it's a brand or a sale, or you're marketing yourself. So do you think that there should be more in regards to squash players doing that? And I know you've touched on it a little bit. Or is it the other side where they're giving away too much to the opponents, and it's probably the right way to go? So perhaps like finding that balance, but at the same time sort of being able to market yourself. How in your opinion do you think that fits in, and which direction should squash as a whole, perhaps institutionally, but also from the perspective of players and coaches, be heading?
Well, I'd be very surprised to see like if a federation, like a country, would go and post like, "Here's all our information," just because they basically put all that money, those resources into gathering that information and having a good program. So I wouldn't expect that, but I think from a player's perspective, like if you're already one of the best players in the world, like I don't know how much that is going to hurt you to share what you're doing, like how much of what you're doing, because everyone's different. So what's right for you doesn't mean it's going to be right for one of your opponents, and they already have their program, their coaches, their team in place that are kind of guiding them and helping them through this. So I mean, I think overall it would benefit squash a lot more. It would make all the viewers, I think, a lot more like informed, and it would help a lot of the amateurs, a lot of the juniors, knowing that you kind of have to build up to this idea. And I think Paul Cole is one of the only ones that I can think of that actually does that sometimes, and that's great. But I remember Serious Squash a couple of weeks ago, I posted like a poll, and I'm like, do you think a squash player has to be able to squat heavy to be a good squash player? Like, because some people have told me like, oh, Ali Farag never uses over X, like a very small number of weight, like it's basically body weight exercises, where I know some other pro squash players are like, going to bench press a lot of weight. And it was pretty split, like 50-50 about what people think. So there's a lot of knowledgeable people that reply to that poll, and they're still split on what they think. And obviously that has to do with body type and genetics and stuff as well. But I still think that kind of like simple question, but like it's hard to get actually a straight answer. I think even if you talk to a knowledgeable trainer, it's more about what what Ali Farag does versus what Paul Cole does, and they can both play at that same standard, but their training would be totally different. And I think that'd be so interesting, because in squash, I really think the winning and losing, like 98% of it happens before they get on court. Like that's all the preparation, all the years of training, all the mental skills they've worked on to get to that point. So I think that would be really, for me, almost be more interesting sometimes than watching the match.
Yeah, right. And on that note, I think another thing that ties into this is the everlasting debate that's been, through and through all the squash circles, and everyone's talked about it. We've talked about it on Sportageous with lots of squash athletes, lots of people in the squash business. The Olympics and squash. Yeah. In all honesty, I've heard a lot of things. I've heard it's a shame squash isn't there. Squash needs to be there. Who cares if squash isn't there? We need to sort out our internal problems first and look at building the game internally. What are your thoughts on, squash not being in the Olympics, in spite of the fact that there's been so much work done, from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, to get the game into the Olympics? And how do you think, like obviously the social media front, it's pretty obvious if the game's in the Olympics, you're going to get a surge in social media and followers and people getting into the game. But how else do you think that can benefit squash as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I remember as a kid just expecting one day, like, I'd represent Canada at the Olympics for squash, and, now I'm, 38 years old, is still not in the Olympics, so it's not something I'm actually expecting to happen. But it's something that should have happened by now because of how good the sport is, how international the sport is, how they can put up a court anywhere. Like, it's definitely a sport that should be in the Olympics. I like, and then you see some of the sports that are getting in that are like, brand new, or they feel like they're, kind of a made up sport. And like, hey, how does squash have so much more history and it's so international? Like, how does it not have that? And I think a lot comes down to just people who aren't squash players, you know just if they're going to watch it, are they actually going to enjoy it? I don't know if it's like a viewer friendly kind of sport unless you actually play squash. I don't know, like, the actual answers for sure why it's not in the Olympics. I actually coached a girl who was in the youth Olympic kind of games in I think it was in Brazil, like, I think 2 years ago. So I thought there was steps that they were taking to get there. But yeah, for some reason, I don't know, no country's actually been able to put it in. And, I don't know how much that would actually impact Canada, because I know the main, I think, point that you would, or the main thing you would get of squash being the Olympics from a lot of countries would be increased funding from the government. So in Canada, there's something called youth, or the podium, own the podium, I think. And basically, they put money into sports where they believe they have the best chance of medaling. So right now, like, because Canada, Canada doesn't have like somebody who's like close to being top three in the world in men's or women's squash. So I would find it hard that our funding would really increase. But some countries where I think they have those players and their maybe government funding would increase quite a bit. So that would be amazing as a squash player, just to be able to go and make a better living and actually have a chance of winning a medal at the Olympics. And I mean, it's the kind of the pinnacle of sport, except for this summer, unfortunately. But yeah, I don't know if I mean, I still think one day it'll probably happen. I don't know if squash needs it. I don't think it would make a huge difference in Canada. Like, most kids who are in Canada, they're thinking about, they either want to play professionally or play at college. And I don't know if that's any of them are growing up anymore, kind of hoping on that Olympic dream, because it's been so long now and still nothing's happened. So I don't know about like Australia and
Yeah.
other parts of the world, but yeah.
Well, I mean, you raise a good point there, where you touch on that, and that's been one of the contentious things, that squash isn't a viewer friendly game if you don't necessarily know the sport. To an extent, I would argue that there are lots of sports in the Olympics that I probably wouldn't personally watch, and a lot of other people wouldn't. And there is space. I may be coming from a place of bias, having some knowledge of the game, but it's action packed. It's fast paced. The things that the athletes do are feats that you don't often get to see in a lot of sports that are in the Olympics. Do you, as a coach, come across people who see the game without having played it and get interested in it? Is that common? Because from what I hear from a lot of people is, oh, my parents played the game, or I had a cousin who was really good at it, and I started playing with them. Do you come across the former quite often, or at all, as a coach, where people come up to you, or young kids, or someone's parents saying, oh, this looks great, like, I want my kid to get involved, or I want to start playing?
Pretty rarely. Like, most people, like, if they haven't played it or seen it, like, they actually have no idea what it is. And then I try to explain it, and they're like, "Oh, kind of like racquetball." I remember one time coming back into customs here in Canada, going through the border, and then they're like, "Oh, how did you afford like a 1 month trip in Bali?" I'm like, "Well, what do you do here in Canada?" I'm like, "I'm a squash coach," and the guy's like, "What? What? You can make enough money as a squash coach?" And like, that's I just think people don't know, like, unless they're in squash, that there's like potential, like there's lots of good clubs and universities and lots of great junior programs all around the world, and it feels like it's a very small niche network. But that's also, kind of the good part about it, because the people who are in it, whether it's a coach, fan, athlete, like they all are obsessed, right? They don't like leave the game unless it's due to some kind of injury or health problem. But even if they do, they stay connected. Those are like usually their best friends. That's still the people that they, hang out with and get together with outside of squash. So I think it's like a really tight knit, close community. Even without that, but it's, generally been kind of tricky to get new people in the sport, because I find as a coach, like if somebody has very little skill in any racket sport, like they're going to go on a squash court and just, not be able to, like, they might hit a few shots, but they can't, two people who are just starting can't really rally together. So it's not going to be fun unless they're playing with somebody who actually can rally and hit the ball back to them. And then when you're doing that, like it basically has to be like a one-on-one or, one-on-two. Like you can't have a big group like kicking around a soccer ball or, chasing a basketball or something like that. So it is a little bit harder to get somebody new into the sport. Obviously, it's such a physical sport too. So if you're a bit older and you're playing squash, like you're gonna be so sore as you get better. Like it's just so unnatural to lunge so much. So I think it physically is very demanding. And even when I'm my fittest, like it's so hard on my body to go and play like a 4 or 5 game match. And if to play a tournament, then I'd have to maybe play again that day or the next day. And it doesn't seem to matter how hard I train. Like my body just has trouble like adapting that. It's just such a tough sport. Like kids get used to it, just, the rubber bands. But for adults, I think it's very hard to get into. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can agree. Being a bit of an amateur player myself, it can get hectic, but it's definitely worth it. To everyone watching this, go try it out if you haven't. It'll be a new experience if nothing else. So take your mates, take your partner, whoever it is, and just go have a try. I mean, there's no harm in it, right? I wanted to move on to something a little that's been in the news a bit more, and it's a bit more relevant in recent times. So I'm not too familiar with how it is in Canada, but I know that varsity squash in the US is a big deal. And a lot of the top athletes, pro athletes, come out of that system. And very recently, I think it was Brown University, which cut funding to varsity squash within their university. Is this unprecedented from what you understand? And do you think that this is sort of, this may potentially lead to some sort of domino effect? And is that something to be concerned about for people within squash?
Well, I've actually been on the inner loop because I've been named like the head coach at Western University here in London. So I'm on all the emails with the CSA in the US. And basically, what Brown did is they actually haven't cut the funding; they just reduced them to club status. So they've said to everyone, okay, we're going to maintain the same level of funding, even though we're only going to have a club status. And obviously, everyone at Brown, like there's a petition going around from a Brown player. The CSA, the College Squash Association, like they've sent in a letter to Brown, just kind of going through the points and saying, how can you do this? Like you're, top 15 school in the men's and women's division. So I honestly have no idea why they did it. I've read Brown's statement, and I don't know if it has anything to do with COVID and just not wanting to travel their students to other universities, because it's not just squash that they've reduced. They've cut actually quite a few of their sports and reduced into club teams. Mm-hmm. And I think basically in their notice, they just basically want to have a more, I guess, well-rounded student experience and not so focused on athletics. Maybe this way they'll be able to have more people participate because it won't be as competitive. And obviously people who are like alumni of Brown, or currently go there and play in that squash team, or are thinking of going there to play in the squash team, like, I'm sure a lot are going to be transferring to other schools. And I don't know, I'd be very surprised if other schools kind of followed this. I have no idea where that that decision came from. It sounded like it was almost no notice at all to the students there.
Yeah.
And, just being this late kind of in this, into the season, looking forwards to next year, like it's just not a lot of time to prepare. So it's, I don't know. I thought it was very surprising. I know a lot of people in the squash scene are unhappy. Like I think the college squash game in the US is kind of driving the sport. So yeah, I think I don't know, very surprising. I don't know if there's another back reason behind what Brown is doing. But yeah, I suggest if you can go to the CSA website, or you go to Brown website as well, you can actually read the information they release to their students, and it's yeah, pretty surprising.
Yeah, because I came across it on social media, and I saw that U.S. squash wasn't very happy. So I thought, why not ask yourself, since I'm talking to you right now. I thought it'd be a good opportunity to get a sense of that myself. So Chris, I wanted to move on to something a little different, and again with elements of that popularity side of things. I know we're treading a bit too much towards that side, but these are some questions that I think that you have insight into. And they would really benefit for us to sort of get your perspective on. Let's take another racket sport
Yeah.
as an example. The pinnacle is tennis, and tennis does this interesting thing where it brings in veterans of the game. It has youth games, variations of the game, things like touch tennis, all while their biggest grand slams are being broadcasted live. So it'll start at 7 a.m. and end at 10 p.m. And, if you want to go and see, the wheelchair tennis, you can go and check that out. If you want to see something else, you can do that too. So from what I understand, what that does is there's a continuous sort of element of it becoming almost like a festival where the sport goes on for a significant amount of days, but you've just got tennis after tennis after tennis in various shapes and forms. What are your thoughts on that in regards to squash, perhaps incorporating that to a larger extent?
Yeah, I think the one most difficult part would be if you're trying to have like multiple events at the same venue, like a pro and junior, different amateur divisions, or just the amount of courts. Usually the pro events are going to be played, at least the big ones, on a glass court with lots of grandstands. If you're doing a men's and women's pro tournament, if you're looking at a draw of like 32 or maybe more for one of the bigger events, like you're just looking at a lot of matches. So I think the numbers would be tough. Although you look at something like the U.S. Junior Open, and they'll have almost 1,000 kids, but they'll use 4 or 5 venues of 10 to 16 squash courts. So they have like this huge resource, and so I think if squash did try to do that, it'd be really interesting because as a junior player, you want to play the British Junior Open. There's an adult British Open as well, and those are kind of the two kind of main tournaments like in the previous 30 years. I don't know if that would help it get more TV coverage that tennis kind of gets. Like I don't know why tennis got to that point where they're just on TV, and I think they did a better job like having their majors set aside and having these big trophies, and people can recognize them. Definitely they've done a better job like promoting their top athletes. Their top athletes tend to win like year after year after year, or they're always there, so people have their favorites. Like people love Roger Federer, they love Nadal, like Andy Murray. So I think everyone kind of those are stars, right? Like nobody's gonna know any of the top squash players if they're not in the squash world. So it's just hard to really get to that point. But I think it's a good idea and something we can learn from. There's definitely a lot more money in tennis. There's a lot from I think even just I've had to read the the Tennis Canada kind of guidelines for their high performance, and they just have way more resources for their athletes. for their coaches. I mean, it's just how organized they are is light years ahead of a lot of the what's happened in Canada. Although I definitely feel like Squash Ontario's like improved way more recently, and I think that it's a good sign for squash in Ontario and also in the U.S. Like I feel like U.S. squash is very organized, and they've helped promote this sport and grow the sport like over tenfold from when I was a kid and playing against Americans. Like it was, almost no American people that were playing squash back then besides hardball or doubles. So
yeah, yeah. And how about variations within the game? So trying out different versions of the sport. And do you think there's room and potential for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're a coach, like you get used to doing that when you're, playing with, younger kids. There's obviously different types of balls and rackets. Now I think in Canada, there's one softball doubles court. So it's basically like, I think that's the game that they use in like the Pan Am games instead of using hardball doubles. And when I was a kid, the club I played at had like 2 hardball courts and then 4 softball courts. So, we did have that ability to kind of play some hardball and softball, but, hardball again is just, if you haven't played it, like the ball moves so quickly, like the sport is, the rallies are super short. It's going to be, if you're actually, kind of skilled a little bit and you play with somebody similar level, like it can be fun. Like if you watched any of Jonathan Power and Diego Elias, like they did a Super Squash Saturday thing, and that was with hardball, and it was better to watch than I thought it was going to be. And, I think there are different versions, just by changing the ball, it can change a lot. If you've ever, I don't know if they probably don't have hardball doubles in Australia, but that's pretty big in Toronto and kind of northeastern United States. So that's something that, a lot of the older people, when they can't handle the singles quite as well, then they kind of move on to that. And there's a lot of ex college players also kind of playing the pro doubles tour. So, it's hard to find any of that stuff online. But I believe they do kind of live stream some of the events. So
Right. That's yeah, it's pretty interesting. I'm not aware either. I actually don't know if we have any of that here in Australia, but
I'd be surprised. Yeah.
yeah, we do have a couple of the future of squash as they're pitching it, which is interactive squash, and I don't know if you know too
Oh
much
yeah.
of. Yeah. So
That,
that's one of the things that has a lot of people talking, and I know that they're doing some work with the PSA as well, the organization called Fun with Balls from Germany, who own that project, and that's definitely an exciting prospect for squash, in my opinion. I don't know if you're too familiar with it. Are there any of those installations in Canada?
not that I'm aware of actually, but I saw, I think it was just yesterday that Birmingham University got a court. So they were the first university to have a court. I've talked to some people in at Fun with Balls or interactive squash. Just
Yeah.
I made like a video for them once to help promote kind of squash and stuff. But I think what they've done is like made something that's like really fun for people who don't know squash and just want to have a racket and a ball, and sometimes not even the racket, just throwing a ball.
Yeah.
And I think that's great way to bring attention to the sport. I remember looking at the cost, like it's not the cheapest thing. So you got to have some money to get one of those courts installed, and then the kind of annual or monthly kind of fees to kind of run their software. But if you can do it, I think it would be really really great for bringing in a class of kids.
Yeah.
And they're gonna remember that a lot more than just like a squash ball that I don't know, trying to have a rally with someone else who's never played. And I think definitely for introduction to squash, it'd be one of the more fun things. Even for somebody who's good, like I'm sure I would enjoy it. You'd probably really enjoy it too.
Yeah, we're actually been in touch with them ourselves. And once things open up a bit more, they've got a couple of installations here in Australia. So we will probably go check them out and see what they're like. So it'll be fun. It's something exciting. It's something fresh and new. And speaking of fresh and new, Chris, I had one last question. We're now sort of shifting into this space, which is almost like post-COVID restrictions in a lot of various parts of the world. How do yourself being a coach, being in all these networks and with these communities and organizations, and being in the loop? How do you think squash moves forward, and what do you see happening with the future of squash in the near future, but also in the long term? Will this change the game in any way? How will people adapt to this, or is it essentially just going to be the same thing, and it's just a matter of time till we get there?
Yeah, I think it's going to take a long time to get back to where we were. I know now the club I'm working at, like it's only singles bookings, which is fine. Like I've done a lot of like solo hitting in my life. So I'm basically, just going to be posting like different videos they can do, different drills, and then I'll do some fun kind of club challenges and say, here's like kind of, let's see who can do the most of this drill or whatever. So you try to have fun with it. Been trying to like do some online live workouts for the members too. So they're kind of staying kind of fit for squash. And then eventually, I think the next steps here are, same household hitting, which should happen in the next week or two. And then eventually there'll be like these bubble groups. So you can play normal squash, but it'll be, 3, 4, 5 people, and you can only play with them. So if anyone does end up getting sick, then it's only that small group who has to really be tested or quarantined. It'd be hard to see tournaments happening, like for sure the first part of next season. Um, I just think that, you probably don't want to have 100 people in a club at a time. So, I've thought about different ways, like maybe doing like a small tournament. Like I think in New Zealand, they're doing like an 8-person tournament. They've had a couple of those. So I think doing like a small tournament. So instead of doing all the divisions one weekend, you might do just one division or 2 divisions on a weekend, just make the draws small so everyone's spread out. And then you can go and do the weekend or that tournament over a course of 6 weeks or 8 weeks. I think that's one idea. You'll probably end up doing a lot more streaming of matches, so people from a club or from around the world can watch the squash and not have to be in attendance. Um, I'm sure we'll lose like some people because either they're a bit older, they don't want to have that risk of, squash is a high risk sport of kind of spreading COVID. I know though, there's possibility of like Richard Millman's produced something like an eye mask, which kind of is like a clear shield that Mustafa Asal wears, but it's like a full face version, so it goes down lower. So I think there is potential. Like I think that's just coming out now that players could play normal squash now with that, and it'd be very hard to kind of transmit anything to your opponent. I think the club I'm at right now, like we have a lot of protocols already in place about like cleaning after every time someone's on the court, and the person when they enter the club they have to wear a mask, and when they can take it off once they get on the squash court. But it's a safe, clean environment. So I think squash clubs, they're going to be a lot different. Like people aren't going to be able to wipe their hands on their side on the wall to dry their hands off. So I think if we take the right precautions, like we'll be fine. It's hard to say 100% there won't be, a single case in a squash club. Like it's going to happen somewhere in the world. So it's just about the club really doing its due diligence and like being prepared and doing everything they can to provide that safe environment and getting the members' trust to come back out. But it could be hard to try to convince someone new to the sport, oh, why don't you come try this? Oh, by the way, like if it is a high risk sport and you might have to wear this face shield when you play. So I think it will take some time. Hopefully the keen people, again, they're not going anywhere. Like people that love squash, you see them posting stuff out online about being outside hitting a squash ball. Lots of people doing solo hitting now that they can. And I think it's been a long 3 months, the longest I've been off squash, probably for quite a while. So it felt good to get back out there this week and actually hit a few balls. So
Yeah, fantastic. And I guess on that note, wishing you all the best during all of this, and thank you for being on the show. For everyone watching, you can head on over to Serious Squash. We'll add the links, so make sure you check him out. Give Chris a follow his great work. And yeah, thanks for being on the show, Chris.
no problem. Happy to be here, and hopefully you enjoy your squash next week.
Absolutely, will do.
All right.
Thanks again.
You're welcome. Yeah, thanks for having me.